Good morning. My name is Dan Margulies. I'm filling in for Rabbi Linzer while he's away. Today is August 25th. It's the 21st of Av, and our daf today is going to be Pei Vav, where you're starting about 20 lines from the bottom on Pei Hey Amud Bet, where it says Amar Rabba. We have been discussing the question of how to calculate shevet. That is, how do you calculate the amount of compensation a person receives based on an injury that for the amount of time that they're going to be off of work or that they'll be unable to do their normal job. And so far, we had seen that the discussion centers around basically the idea that a person will be unable to do the work that they used to do, and now they have to be assessed at the value of a type of work that they're able to do now that they've received this injury. For example, a person who could have been any sort of work, now suppose their hand has been injured, at least in Talmudic times, that would mean a person could probably not do very many jobs that you would need both hands for. So you're assessed at the level of the Shomer Kishuim, someone who sits and watches pumpkin patch, because that's a type of work where you need to walk around, but you don't need to use your hands. And if it was someone who had been injured in the leg, they have to be assessed at the rate that a person who's a Shomer at the gate of the city, because a toll collector is someone who just sits in one place. They don't have to even walk around. So if you injured your foot, then that would be the level you're assessed at. And if a person had become blind from this injury, then they would be assessed based on their ability to grind wheat. They could sit at the millstone, matchino b'reichaim, but at the same time, they would not have to move around at all. They could do a job even that doesn't require the use of their eyes. And the Gemara had said if a person became deaf based on this injury, then you pay demei kulo. You pay the entire value. Why? Because sorry, I'm jumping ahead a little bit. Okay. The Gemara says, Amar Rabba, kitat yado notein lo demei yado. V'shevet roino hakilu shomer kishuin. Sorry, we got farther than I thought we said. We got up to where it says Bayra. Right? Okay, so we're actually more like 15 lines up from the bottom. Okay. So by Rabba asked, kitat yado v'lo imduhu. So what if a person severed someone else's hand and the Beit Din did not get a chance to assess the damage yet? Okay, step one, Shiveret Raglo, and then he went and broke the guy's foot, Velo Imduhu, and they did not assess the damage yet. Simeat Eino, Velo Imduhu, and then he blinded him, and then they didn't assess the damage yet. Ulbaso Chersho, and then he made him deaf. So Mahu. Mi Amrinan Kevan de Lo Imduhu Bechad Umdina Bechad Umdina Sagile, the Aivle Dmekule. So maybe you'll say that because they didn't get a chance to actually pay it yet, or they didn't get a chance actually to assess the damage yet, then at that point, since they only do one assessment at the end based on all four injuries, you should just pay one lump sum. Or maybe each injury has to be assessed on its own accord, and then he has to pay 4 separate payments. So what's the nafkamina? Meaning, what should be the difference? If it's the same injury, it should end up having the same payment either way. So we're going to see. Yeah.
So we were discussing that if there's nizek, then it comes along with everything else. And then we said if there's one thing individually, then it can be paid individually. Like let's say tar, like you ate him or whatever.
Right.
But can you couple it without nizek? Let's say that he's now too embarrassed.
So that's going to be coming up on today's daf.
We're
going to see. There are going to be cases that we're going to deal with. They're going to deal with like just boshet and not nezek and things like that.
Yeah,
for example, we're going to see
2 payments. So
for sure. Yeah. Meaning any of them could be paid based on the assessment of the situation individually.
So it's not just nizek. It's not just 5 things or 1 thing. It could be 2.
Right.
3.
It could be 2 or 3. Right, depending on the circumstances. Okay. So nafkamina. What's the nafkamina between if it was 1 assessment or 4 separate assessments? Because tsar and boshet are going to be different for each one. That is, the shevet and the ripui are in the end are going to work out the same because the amount of devaluation of each one is going to add up till the point of the next one. So in the end, it's going to cover the full spectrum. But tsar and boshet, each injury is going to incur more pain and suffering, and each injury is going to incur more embarrassment in terms of how this person presents in public arena. And therefore, tsar and boshet, if you assess them individually, is going to compound to actually a higher amount of tsar and a higher amount of boshet. And the fact that if you pay, so for the other three, that is shevet, ripui, and nezek, the fact that you pay for the whole thing, that is the person has been injured to the point of a full assessment. So in that sense, you're saying, okay, you're paying kiman de katlei dami. It's like you've killed the person. That is not obviously not killed the person. We don't let you pay if you've killed someone. But the sense is that since you've impaired their ability to work, the shevet is like you're paying the entire person's ability to earn a living. The ripui is a very significant medical expense. And the nezek, obviously, you've damaged them in an extensive way, such that a person's value in the slave market will be incredibly severely reduced. So that's also like that you would have to pay almost like to the sense the whole person's worth. Obviously, a person doesn't have a worth, but in the sense we have to have an assessment for that for nezek. Okay, so the Gemara says, "Baha yahiv le'dame kule." So if you pay the money for the person's entire self, taru boshes mihatiko chad v'chad yahiv. Okay, so then what about taru boshes? Because the whole point was that taru and boshes are going to be compounded further. You're actually going to end up paying more if you do separate assessments than if you do the whole thing. The kochad v'chad yahiv. Taru boshes, because taru and boshes are going to be separate. So if you'll say that the reason why is because they didn't get a chance to assess in between each of the injuries, so and then you could pay one lump sum all at the end. But if they had assessed the value in between each injury, but the person just didn't get a chance to pay it yet, then what do you say? So mahu. Maybe it's because each injury was individually assessed by Lametavle, so maybe he has to give it to him each one separately. So then, or maybe the alternative is that if the person didn't pay yet, then there's no need to pay each one individually. Rather, you can combine them into the one lump sum, and then the tzar and boshet are going to accordion collapse on each other because they'll be double counting. So the Gemara ends teku. That means all of Rava's questions about this have been left unresolved. That is, Rava presented two different possibilities. Either we should assess tzar and boshet in particular should be assessed based on individual damages if there was no assessment in between, or maybe even if there was assessment in between, as long as the payment didn't come through, they should be assessed individually, or maybe they should just be assessed all together from the beginning to the end and ignoring all the details in the middle. Yes?
Does that mean if he's paying just the entire value, he's not going to pay for humiliation and pain at all?
He will pay tzar and boshet for the sum total of the injuries, but not for each one individually. The Gemara's point is that if we would assess how much tzar and boshet were involved for each of these four injuries, the sum of all four would be more than if you would assess it each one by itself. So, because presumably a person gets in one accident and they have all four injuries at the same time, the amount of boshet, for example, that they'll feel, or the amount of pain that they feel at one moment or for that one period of time is going to be less than if they went through four individual injuries. The Gemara ends with teku. Teku is an unresolved question. That is, Rava's question was left unanswered. Interestingly enough, and the Rambam does this consistently, the answer when we have to paskin halacha based on a teku is usually that we're kind of in a case of doubt. And in a monetary case, we would say, okay, you can't use the conclusion of the teku to take someone else's money away. But that means, itafas lo mafkinan. If the person trying to claim this money had already grabbed it, had taken it from the person who he thought owed him, then you can't take it back from him because he has a certain ground to stand up. Strangely enough, the Rush in the back here actually paskins, he thinks one side actually makes sense. If you take a look at the Rush thinks it makes more sense to assess each one individually. It's right at the end of Siman Hey in the Rush.
Makes sense to me too, but it makes sense to me.
But the Tosas Yom Tov in the Pilpul Tacharifta says, how can the Rush just decide for himself to decide a question that the Gemara leaves unanswered? That is fine. It might make sense to a certain amount of. It might make sense, but it doesn't give you the right to paskin. It's a teku. Teku means it's left unresolved. So it's a good question. Okay, so it's an interesting question. We have to see how different Rishonim approach. What does it mean, the teku?
Also,
okay.
That means you're not making a distinction between each act having been done separately, as opposed to the person had an accident and it all happened to him.
Well, obviously it's not an accident. Obviously, we're talking about a case where a person injured someone else. But the point is whether it was 4 individual acts of violence, separate incidents, or one all at once, right?
I still don't get the nezek part. Meaning, the sum of the nezikin is greater than the whole.
No, the sum of the nezikin
is.
Because
hear me out. Because I first I do your leg, and then pay the value of the leg. I do your arm, pay the value.
But how do we assess the value of the leg? The value of the leg is
how much would it be a legless slave versus a legged slave?
And then it's going to be a person who is blind and has no leg compared to a person who is seeing and has no leg. So then that's one more step. And then now we're going to go from here to here. So then 1, 2, 3, they're all
but
three
they're each different times. As opposed to having it once and it's
correct. But they're each one going to add up to the whole thing.
Right, but I did it separate times. Let's say I did this over.
But the nezek adds. But the nezek adds up. The point of how nezek is assessed is that the first nezek gets you from here to here, second one here to here, third one here to here.
Right.
So then the whole thing, if it would be assessed all at once, is going to cover the same thing. The problem is
then at the end it is how much is a slave worth? Whereas I'm doing it 10 times along the way. How much is a slave worth? What I'm saying is the last
the point is that
the
devaluation of the. But that's the point is that the way this slave market at least calculates those values is that it's going to work out evenly in the end. You're saying how much is the whole slave worth? Right. So then in the end, the fourth one, that is if you made him deaf, then he's worth nothing. And the idea is that then the slave is also at that point a blind, deaf, legless, handless slave is worth nothing.
So what's
the
question?
That's the sense, right?
No. So my point is, this is 5 different times. I'm saying you get the 5th one plus the 4th one, and then plus the 3rd one.
Plus is this plus this plus this plus this is this.
I understand, but it's done incrementally.
Okay.
So meaning it was over the course of 15 years. So he gets first the pain. He gets at the end of at the last time he gets everything.
Then he doesn't get everything. He gets the difference between this one and this one. And the previous time he got the difference between this one and this one.
It's incremental.
It's incremental. It's like
I know, I understand. Because they've done it at different times. What I'm trying to say is that and everyone knows that it happened. So you should get
each assessment has a different starting point.
I know.
It's incremental.
That's my point.
And it ends up at the same place.
No, it doesn't.
Michael, maybe we can talk about it afterwards. I'm not sure I understand the question.
If it ends up at the same place, then what's the difference?
It's like saying 5 includes 4, 3, 2, and 1, but 5 plus 4 plus 3 plus 2 plus 1.
But it's not 5 plus 4.
That's
It's 1 plus 1 plus 1 plus 1, and it's 3 plus 1. Or it's 4. Yes, it is. That's exactly the point.
So what's the question?
It's 5 minus 1, you get the 4. Then
you get 1.
Well, you get the 4 minus 1, you get the 3. Whatever. Either way, we're doing the same thing.
Right.
If it's going to end up at the same place, what's the question being
I
asked?
disagree with this premise.
The question being asked is about tsar and boshet. That is, each individual injury is going to have its own level of embarrassment and its own level of tsar, which in total are going to add up to more than the amount of tsar and boshet if all of the injuries were assessed at once. And that's because a person suffers pain based on each injury. And if you're in pain, your whole body all at once is going to be less than each injury.
What do you mean when you're saying it's going to end up at the same place?
That's about nezek. Nezek, ripui, and shevet are going to add up to the same. We're on the 4th to the last line of Peham with Bet. The Gemara says, by Rabba. Rabba asked a question. That is, we already had Rava's questions. Now we have Rabba. And it's going to come back. We're going to see. The Gemara is going to address this later. So by Rabba. Shevet ha-pochato b'damim mahu. What is a case of shevet, that is amount paid for time off of work, that reduces the person's value? This is a little bit of a strange formulation. Look in Rashi. That is, a person got an injury such that they have to take time off of work, but the injury will heal. And therefore, the presumption is that, on the one hand, you're not really paying nezek because the injury is going to heal. But at the same time, how do you assess the shevet in that case? Because we thought the whole point of shevet was that for the rest of this person's life, he's going to be unable to do this kind of work. He's going to have to do a lesser kind of work. So you have to compensate him in that way. But here, the person is going to be able to go back to work. He's going to have 2 weeks off of work, and then he's going to be fine. So that's the question. Okay. So what do we do? So suppose someone hit someone else on the hand, and it got a horrible bruise or got a horrible scab or something. And in the end, it's going to heal. It might take a month. It might take 2 months. But in the end, it's going to be fine. Okay. So maybe because it's going to grow back, it's going to heal, then he doesn't have any obligation to pay him for shevet at all. Because fine, even though you're off of work for now, but you're going to go back to your original job. Okay. Or... Odilma hashtam yad afachte. So no, right now you reduced his earning power. That is, at least for these 2 months, he's going to have time off of work. So this is the question of what shevet is to begin with. That is, this whole time at least, the Mishnah was still unclear. What does shevet mean? Shevet, does it mean the time off of work because of the injury, or does it mean a lifelong reduction in earning power based on a lifelong injury? Those are two very different things.
Why would you assume that it doesn't include everything? The Torah doesn't say what it is, so they assume the most expansive definition.
I don't know. We have to ask that question. So Rabbi asked the question, so we're going to see. Meaning there's two very different
possibilities. It would be a
possibilities.
lifelong thing. I always thought it was potentially temporary.
Why? I cut off your hand, so now I'm never going to be able to do a job
How do
that
you know that's what
requires
it's
two
talking
hands.
about? Meaning the Torah says, I hit you, whatever,
Because-
I bruise you. A kviyah is not
Okay.
necessarily something that's...
Okay, so until this point at least, the examples in the Gemara had been a severed hand or a broken leg, which at that time, which they didn't have the kinds of bone setting that we have. A broken leg meant it was going to heal wrong and you weren't going to be able to walk anyway. Or being blinded, a permanent injury that's going to fundamentally affect.
The Torah's talking about.
So the Torah doesn't say anything.
That's
The
my
Torah
point.
says
The Mishnah said that
Rakshiv
too.
Toyitain.
Mishnah said that too. Mishnah said kitei yado.
Kitei Yado, you cut off his hand. So we're going to have to see. So Rabba asked this question. It's a very good question. That is, we're really getting to the core of what is Shevet actually compensation for. Is it for lost wages during the time for your recovery? Or is it lost wages because you've fundamentally been altered in terms of your earning power? Okay. So Tashma. Hamakavi ve'imo. What if a person hits their parents? Velo asaba en chabura, but it didn't leave a bruise. We know the halacha is makavi ve'imo mot yumat. If you injure your parents in such a way that it does leave a bruise, then that's a capital crime. Because even though it doesn't actually kill your parents, but the fact that you've injured them so substantially is such a disrespect to your parents that that's considered to be a capital crime. Yes.
I might be very thick because the Torah says, so you're obviously getting back.
Nikah hamakeh for capital punishment. That's what that pasuk
But
is
what
saying.
is you're walking amishanto on your own.
Right, so that means that in a case where a person was injured mortally, but recovered enough to be able to walk, that means that it wasn't considered to be a mortal wound. That means this injury, if I hit you and then you have internal bleeding and 3 weeks later you die, I could still be put to death for that because I injured you in such a way that the injury killed you, even though it wasn't right then.
Right.
What this is saying is if a person gets up after the injury and then a month later dies, it was proof that the injury was not a mortal wound at the time of the injury, and therefore the person who caused the damage is not a murderer.
And then
That's what that pasuk is about.
And then the shevet is.
Shevet is about how much do you pay for someone's off work.
But he died, so you're still paying him for the shevet.
No, it's saying if he didn't die,
Right.
then he has
But still,
shevet
they're still,
for his time.
they're still incapacitated.
He was incapacitated from his injuries. Exactly, he was unable to work.
Yeah, it doesn't seem like shot.
Oh, it doesn't have to be the pshat. It has to be what the halacha is. Okay. Tashma, hamakavi v'imo b'lasa b'hen chabura. If you hit your parents in such a way that did not leave a bruise, v'hachovel b'chaver b'yom kippurim, or if you punch someone on Yom Kippur, chayav bekulan, you're obligated to pay all 5 things. We know if you punch someone on Shabbat, if you injure someone on Shabbat, or if you hit your parents in such a way that it does leave a bruise, because those are capital crimes, we would say kimle de Rabbi Minei, and you would be exempt from the monetary obligation. But punching someone on Yom Kippur because you're chayav karet, or hitting your parents in such a way that does not leave a bruise, you would be obligated to pay all 5. But what does it sound like? It sounds like if you hit your parents and it didn't leave a bruise, you would still have to pay all 5. That is an injury that does not leave a permanent mark of any kind, then still you would pay shevet. That is, the injury, even a temporary injury, would require shevet. So that's what it sounds like from that braita. Okay. So hi, lo asabem chabura hechidami. But what case is it that does not leave a bruise? La kigon shikali yadav sofer lachzor katani chayav bekulan. So doesn't it sound like a contradiction? Because it sounds like what injury doesn't leave a permanent injury, a permanent scar, would be if you hit them on the hand and eventually it's going to grow back. And it said chayav bekulan, you're obligated in all 5. So amrei hachi b'mayaskina. No, this is what we're talking about. Kigon shecher show. It wasn't that you hit your parents on the hand and then it healed. It was that you injured them in such a way that there was no blood to begin with. That is, you made your parents deaf. You injured your parents in such a way that it made them lose their hearing. And does that really not leave a wound? But Rabbi said, and we're trying to answer Rabba's question to begin with, so it's very good that it was Rabba who we're talking about. So if you make your father deaf, you will be executed for that. Why? Because the way a person becomes deaf in that kind of an injury is that a drop of blood goes into the ear, and that's what causes the deafness. And so therefore, now the question becomes, basically what they're describing is a kind of an internal bleeding, it sounds like. That is, something happened internally which involved bleeding, and that's what causes the injury that results in the loss of hearing. Interestingly enough, though, it seems to be somewhat of a machloket about whether or not internal bleeding counts for this question of the capital crime of injuring your parents or not. A bit of an interesting extended discussion. Also a question of what malacha is it to cause someone to have a bruise on Shabbat. It's, I think, maybe even a three-way machloket in the Rishonim. One possibility is shochet. It's a tolada of shochet. Shochet means to kill an animal. So, well, 1 second, we're going to get to that. So one possibility is shochet. That is, if I kill an animal and the blood obviously drains out. So if I punch someone and it causes the blood to group together in that place, that's kind of like shochet. Or maybe it's tzovea, as Michael said. It's like dyeing because you've turned their skin from one color to a different color. Or maybe it's dash, because we know that the malacha of dash, which is threshing, removing the kernels from the wheat stalk, also becomes applied to things like milking a cow or squeezing a fruit. So too, punching a person in such a way that it causes a bruise is drawing the blood out of their flesh in such a way that it's kind of like squeezing out a fruit. So those are at least three possibilities for what malacha chovel is. The Gemara takes it for granted almost that chovel b'chabeiro on Shabbat is one of the malachot, but it's not clear which one it is. Okay, so Rabbi had said that causing your parents to lose their hearing is something that you would be killed for because it's impossible for the hearing to be lost without a drop of blood being dislodged. So that couldn't be the case we're talking about, because we have to be talking about a case where there was an injury that a person could cause their parents, which does not leave any kind of a bruise and does not involve any kind of bleeding, but at the same time is temporary, such to prove that there's such a thing as shevet even for a temporary injury. Okay. Ella, it was a case where a person shaved his father's head. Okay, so we're going to see. So gilcho, well, that's exactly the Gemara's question. Gilcho, so that the hair is going to grow back. That's what you're telling me, that's an injury? Okay, so no, he used some kind of a depilatory cream or a resin that burns the skin and burns off the hair, and it burns off the hair permanently. Nowadays we have things like laser hair removal, things like that are a permanent hair removal. Okay, so if it's permanent hair removal, then it's a permanent injury. Okay, so then how can you make it all other five, though? It's still fine. You'll say that that's some kind of a nezek. You've damaged this person in some way. So tsar, di'itle, kartufne bereshe, the person had fissures or cracks in the skin on his head, and therefore when you put the cream that burned in the kartufne, so and it causes burning because of those scars on the head. So ripui, what about ripui? The healing costs debayas asuye, because he needs to go to the doctor for that. Because once you have cracks in your skull, on your the skin on your scalp, and then you put this depilatory cream and it burns, you have to go to the doctor. Okay, shave it. What about shave it? Meaning, what work do you lose from becoming bald and having this injury on your head? The have markid bekube, because he was a juggler, a dancer in the bar. That he was some kind of a jester or some kind of a comedian type. So in that case, so why? Because he has to go and wag his head around in front of people as part of, I guess, the way they would dance back then, and therefore he can't do that because he has these injuries to his scalp. So, and boshet, ein lecha boshet gadol mizeh, and forcing someone who is not naturally going bald to go bald prematurely is very embarrassing.
I don't want to say that baldness itself isn't.
Well, obviously, there are Achronim who point that out, which is to say, where did we ever hear that baldness is embarrassing? Everybody, very many men and very many women, frankly, lose their hair at some point, and that's just natural. It's natural to age gracefully. What's embarrassing is if you lose your hair prematurely, if you lose your hair all at once when you weren't expecting it. To take someone who has a full head of hair or even a partial head of hair and take it all off overnight, that would be very embarrassing. Obviously, it depends on the cultural context as well. That is, if you live in a culture where people regularly shave their heads or things like that, and people have very short hair, it may not be as embarrassing. The boshet might be relatively minor, at least in Chazal's time.
Our question.
But our question, the point is shevet. Here, the shevet is assessed. Why? He gets shevet because his job was to be a jester in the bar, and he can't do that job anymore, at least for a while. So it sounds like a temporary thing. Obviously, it's going to heal. That is, the hair has...
Photos are depilatory.
Okay, so the hair is not going to grow back, but the ability to shake his head around is because of the kartufne, is because of the cracks in his scalp, which are going to heal. So that's one possibility. But the question of the hair is a good point. It's not clear, but the point is that the boshet is assessed based on the job that he has. This becomes a question again in the Rosh.
You mean the shevet?
The shevet, sorry. The shevet is calculated based on the job he has now. It's not just based on the job you could do once you were injured. It's also a comparison between your current job that you're unable to do now compared to something else. So he
still gets paid as a cucumber watcher, but it's just that.
Well, I don't even know if he's only he could do many
it.
jobs. He probably even be getting paid above the cucumber watcher.
No, I understand. But shevet is you pay him as that's.
No, we saw that if for different kinds of injuries you might pay a different amount based on what they're able to do.
Right, but you still take some sort of low-level...
Presumably it has to be some kind of a low-level
work. This
work.
Paid more, and which is why you're getting compensated. If you got a job that got paid less, you wouldn't...
Correct. Correct. So I don't know. It doesn't say here what job you would assess him for, but presumably the case of the cucumber watchman was because he had his hand cut off, so he couldn't do any kind of manual labor. Here, this is someone who had a skilled kind of labor that required, a more creative type job, and now maybe he's going to have to get a work as a manual laborer that's going to pay less than his skilled job. It's interesting just to note that that's sort of the variable, subjective component of shevet. Okay. 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 Umilta de baile l'rabba. Meaning, this was all a question that Rabbi had. Rabbi didn't know whether or not you should have shevet for an injury that was going to heal. But what was a question for Rabbi was obvious to Abaye one way and was obvious to Rava the other way. That is, Rava and Abaye, one generation after Rabbi and Rabbi Yosef. So Rava and Abaye have a big machlokas about something that their teacher, Rabbi, had a question about. So obviously, you can imagine that this would happen. They're sitting in yeshiva, and the Rosh Yeshiva asks a question, and he says, I don't really know. I kind of see both sides of it. And the two top students each pick a side, and they become invested in it. So it's just like an interesting point. Okay, so Rav and Abaye, why? The Itmar, what about a case where a person hit someone on the hand, and it got some kind of a swelling or bruise in such a way that it was unusable, but then it would heal eventually? Abaye Amar noten lo shevet gedola ve'shevet ketana. He pays a large shevet and a small shevet. Look in Rashi, because otherwise we will not understand what he's talking about. Shevet gedola demei yado. Shevet gedola sounds like it means what we've been calling nezek. That is, the fact that you will never be able to use this limb. Nezek is you were devalued on the slave market. And we discussed yesterday how the devaluation on the slave market takes into account the amount of work a person would be able to do over a lifetime using that limb. So shevet gedola sounds like the lifelong change based on what we've been calling nezek. Shevet ketana kol yamim sheyipola mishkav ro'ino toki ilu hu shomer kishuin. So a temporary loss of labor, and we assess at that minimum wage level based on the injury to the hand, he has to do a type of work. So shevet gedola becomes an interesting question. Why? Because it seems like the way Abaye conceptualizes what we've been calling nezek is basically the same idea as shevet. Shevet is the amount of reduction of your earning power over a lifetime based on a permanent part of the injury, and over the short term in terms of the part of the injury that's going to heal. So both of those are each part of shevet. The Mishnah had used the term nezek comparison to shevet, interestingly. Also to note, part of the question here is how much are we comparing chovel to nizkei mamon. Nizkei mamon, we only assess nezek, the amount of damage caused. Here, because we have all five things, it actually becomes interesting to compare each of them to each other, and Abaye seems to compare what we've been calling nezek to shevet, because shevet is also a time off of work. The way we think about that is a reduction of earning power, even for the nezek as well. You can imagine a human being has all sorts of value beyond their ability to work. Nonetheless, the work is what we can assess in court. in a reasonable way. Okay, Rava Amar, Rava says you only pay shevet for each day and day. That means
Temporary loss of
a
labor.
temporary loss of what Abai called shevet tana. That is, Rava never heard of shevet gedola. Rava heard of nezek, and he thinks of them as two separate things. So obviously, nezek is something that only applies if there's a permanent damage, and shevet is something you pay for temporary. So itmar hakotea yad eved ivri shel chavero. What if a person, and now we have to go back in time a long time, what if you chop off an eved ivri's hand? Eved ivri is obligated to work for someone, but he doesn't actually, he's not owned by anyone. He owns himself. He's a free person in a sense, but he's an indentured servant. So eved ivri shel chavero, Abai amar noten lo shevek gedola le'eved, v'shevek tana l'rav. You pay shevek gedola, that is for the injury, you pay to the eved, and to the master, you pay the amount of time that he won't be able to work because he has a contractual agreement to work for the master. So who owns the rights to his labor for the temporary period of time when he's recovering was the master. Okay, Rava Amar Hakol Yinatein LaEved. According to Rava, everything goes to the slave because the evaluation of Nezikin is not about who bought the rights to your labor. It's about whether or not you can earn the money for yourself. V'ilkach behen karka, and he, the slave, should buy land with that money. V'harav ochel peirot, and the master is allowed to eat the produce of the field. That is, the type of relationship that the master has in terms of the ownership of the work of the eved is not that he owns the eved's labor. He's allowed to be ochel peirot. He can get the benefits from the labor. So the same financial model we know by, or in a marriage as well. Who owns the land compared to who can get the fruits, get the produce of that land. So too is the relationship of the Eved Ivri to the master. The master does not own the work itself. He only owns the perot, the fruits of the labor. Okay. So this is a machloket between Abai and Rava. So pshita pichad etzel atzmo ve'etzel rabbo lo pichet. But what? He wasn't devalued for his master. He was only devalued for himself. It's a question on Rava's shita. Okay, hechidami de paske l'reish avner or l'reish nechire. Now maybe it was that his earlobe was cut or his nostril was cut, and therefore that's when all of the nezek goes to him himself. Hakol atzmo, it goes to him. Pichet etzel rabbo plug to the rabbo. But if he was injured in a place where it's going to affect his ability to work directly, well then that's going to be machloket between Abai and Rava. But that is, everyone agrees that if even Abai will agree to Rava that if the injury was in a place that doesn't actually affect his ability to work, then the only thing that the owner is losing out on, not owner, the slave master is losing out on, is the perot, and therefore he should get the nezikin money, buy a piece of land, and the perot will go to the master. Okay, we're in the middle of Pevav Amud Aleph. Boshet, hakolafi hamivayesh vehamit bayesh. The Mishnah had said that boshet, embarrassment, is assessed based on everything is assessed based on who is the mivayesh, who got embarrassed, who did the embarrassing, and hamit bayesh, the person who got embarrassed. So we have to see. So it's very subjective. So manei matnitin lo Rabbi Meir velo Rabbi Yehuda eli Rabbi Shimon. So who is our Mishnah like? It's not like Rabbi Meir, not like Rabbi Yehuda. It must be Rabbi Shimon. So we're going to see a discussion of a three-way machloket between these three Tanaim. Okay, Ditnan, the Breita says. V'kulan ro'in otan ki'ilu hem b'nei chorim she'yardu min nechsein shem b'nei Avraham Yitzchak v'Yaakov. Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says, in terms of boshet, we assess every person's boshet as if they are wealthy people who have just lost their inheritance. That is, they're wealthy people in terms of their stature, but they don't actually have any property. Why? Because every Jewish person is a child, a descendant of Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, and that gives us all equal stature. And therefore, it obviously can't fit the Mishnah because the Mishnah said it was very subjective, and Rabbi Meir has a very objective, singular standard. Rabbi Yehuda Omer Hagadol lefi godlo v'hakatan lefi katno. Rabbi Yehuda takes a very subjective standard. He says a richer person or a more prominent person is assessed on that, and a less prominent person is assessed based on that. And it's more embarrassing if you embarrass someone very prominent or very famous than if you would embarrass someone who nobody knows. Okay, Rabbi Shimon Omer, Ashirim ro'inotan ki'ilu hem b'nei chorim she'yardu min nechseihem. According to Rabbi Shimon, rich people, wealthy people, we assess them as if they are free people who have just lost all of their money. That is, we treat them at a low standard of what it means to be a rich person. That is, we don't really take into account the fact that you're wealthy. However, aniyim kipchutim shebahen. And poor people, we assess them as if they're the poorest of the poor. That is, they're basically two gradations, and we bump you down to a very low level. Like I said previously many times, this is based on the principle that in court, we have to use a very high threshold burden of proof. So we can at most extract a minimal amount from a person because we have the principle, if you want to prove it, you have to be able to prove. The burden of proof is on the person coming to extract money, so that's going to be a limitation in terms of how much we can actually impose in terms of this boshet. So it has to be a minimal amount of boshet. So money. Rabbi Meir matnitin katani hakol lefi hamivayesh v'hamit. So Rabbi Meir obviously doesn't fit the Mishnah because the Mishnah had said it goes based on who got embarrassed and who did the embarrassing. Rabbi Meir kulahu b'hadi hadadin. Rabbi Meir thinks it's all the same standard for everyone. The Rabbi Yehuda matnitin katani hamivayesh hasuma chayav. And it can't be Rabbi Yehuda because the next Mishnah we're going to see on the next Amud says if you embarrass a blind person, you're chayav, you're obligated to be. Rabbi Yehuda omer suma elo boshet. But Rabbi Yehuda is the one who says a blind person does not receive boshet. Elalav Rabbi Shimon, it must be Rabbi Shimon. Afilu tema Rabbi Yehuda. Maybe you could say it is Rabbi Yehuda. Ki amar Rabbi Yehuda suma elo boshet. When Rabbi Yehuda said that a blind person does not pay boshet, lemishkal minei, to extract boshet from him. If a blind person embarrasses someone else, then you don't make him pay boshet. Aval lemetzva le yahavinan le. But if a blind person got embarrassed by someone else, the blind person actually can collect boshet. So it works only in one direction, according to Rabbi Yehuda. Okay. And the seifa of the next Mishnah says, if you embarrass someone while they're asleep, you're obligated to pay. The yashen shebiesh patur. But if you're sleeping, and while you were in sleeping, you did something that embarrassed someone, I can imagine the person, you roll over in bed and you pull the sheet off someone and they're lying there naked in front of their friends and everyone laughs at them. Okay, so the yashen shebiesh patur, you're exempt in that case because boshet, to be obligated to pay boshet, you have to have kavanah levayesh. You have to have intention to do something embarrassing.
No,
Adam muad la'olam for nizikin, exactly. Right. So for boshet, you don't say adam muad la'olam. Okay. V'loktani suma shebiesh patur nechlal de lo shna hacha v'lo shna hacha. So no, this seems to be proof against reading Rabbi Yehuda that way because suma, a blind person, it doesn't say one way patur, one way chayav, like the way the Mishnah had distinguished between a sleeping person, and therefore. It must be that Mishnah is Rabbi Shimon. It's the only possibility because it doesn't fit Rabbi Meir. It doesn't fit Rabbi Yehuda because it doesn't fit his shita about a blind person, and therefore it must be Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon's opinion seemed difficult to fit with the way the Mishnah was. That is, the Mishnah said it's all based on who the person did the embarrassing and who the person got embarrassed. According to Rabbi Shimon, we bump everyone down to the lowest bracket of if you're rich, you're bumped down to the lowest rich person's bracket, and if you're poor, we bump you down to the lowest poor person's bracket. So it's a little bit different between them, but it basically is a way of telling us how to read the Mishnah, read it like the way Rabbi Shimon's shita is. Unless, of course, the Mishnah were really a fourth position, but the Gemara doesn't want to suggest that. They want to suggest that Rabbi Shimon is the Mishnah. So man tana lahad.
How do you embarrass a sleeping person?
How do you embarrass? You could, person is sound asleep.
If they stay asleep.
They stay asleep.
How do they know they were embarrassed?
Well, that's exactly the point. You embarrass someone who's asleep, nonetheless, you're still chayav. Why? Suppose a person was asleep, and you know, this is a thing people do nowadays. Someone is asleep, and they draw on their face, at summer camp or something like that, or you put whipped cream in their hand, and they go like this, right? The person is sound asleep, but they've done something embarrassing. You did something to them that was embarrassing while they were asleep.
If they had been awake, they would have been embarrassed.
Of course, it's not about what. So we're going to see. It's going to come up in the next Amud. It's not only about, we have to keep going, but we're going to see it's not just about whether or not the person himself was embarrassed. It's how society experiences the embarrassment as a whole. Okay, so man tana lahad tana Rabbanan nitkaven levayeshet hakatan v'yeshet hagadol noten legadol dmei b'ushto shel katan. If you had intention to embarrass a minor, a child, and instead you ended up doing something that embarrassed an adult. So you pay to the adult the amount of money that you meant to have to obligate yourself to embarrass the child. That is, you pay a lesser amount because it has to still be based on your kavanah. It has to be based on what you intended to do. Okay. If you intended to embarrass a slave and you ended up embarrassing a free person by accident, you pay the free person the amount of money you would be obligated to pay for embarrassing the slave. So money, who is this? Lo Rabbi Meir, velo Rabbi Yehuda, velo Rabbi Shimon. It doesn't fit any of those three positions. So katan benechasim, gadol benechasim. So it means katan means someone who has very few possessions, And gadol means someone with many possessions, a rich person, a poor person, a rich person, not a child and an adult. Okay, so Rabbi Meir who it can't be Rabbi Meir because he says everyone is the same level. The Rabbi Huda da Amar ein lavadim boshet, and it can't be Rabbi Huda because Rabbi Huda thinks that slaves have no boshet at all, because we know their general sense that the way an Eved Kanani is seen by halacha often is that Eved behefkera nichale, slaves live a very promiscuous lifestyle. Perhaps there's no sense of embarrassment for the slaves, things like that, or not in the sense that they wouldn't be embarrassed at a personal level, but the way society sees them, nothing would be embarrassing in public if you're a slave. That's the suggestion. Okay, according to Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Shimon da Amar nitkavein v'yish zeh patur, and Rabbi Shimon is the one who says if you intended to embarrass one person and you ended up embarrassing someone else by accident, you're totally exempt because it has to go entirely based on your kavanah. So then it can't fit any of those three. So my time the katla ma katla adim kavein lei. So maybe you should compare it to a case of murder. If I went to murder someone, it only counts as murder if I kill the person who I meant to kill. That's what's called in Latin, right? Mens rea. You had the thought of doing that crime. You have to have a premeditation to make it murder. Okay? So you had to have planned who you were planning to kill. Because he was crouching in wait for him to try to attack him. That's from the discussion of the manslaughter versus murder. What's the difference between manslaughter and murder? Manslaughter, you had no premeditation. You had no intent to kill this person. That's part of the defining characteristic. So adshi kavenlo, you had to have intent for it. Boshet nami had to be kavenle. So for boshet as well. So we see boshet, fascinatingly, Chazal and of course later sources pick up on it, compare the act of boshet, embarrassing someone, very much to the act of murder. That is, we know how malbina pnei chaveira b'Rabbi chayav mita, the obviously hyperbolic statement, perhaps not so hyperbolic, but that embarrassing a person in public is equivalent to actually killing them. Shofech damim, you've taken the blood out of their face because they bleach white out of embarrassment. So it's the same kind of action. Okay. So boshet nami adim kavin, so you have to have intention, and that's where we learn it from. We learn the fact that boshet requires intention from the comparison to the difference between murder and manslaughter. That is, embarrassing someone is more comparable to murder than manslaughter, and therefore, if you embarrass someone without intent, unintentionally, it doesn't count. Okay, one of the psukim we learn boshet from is a case there are two men fighting, and the wife of one of them comes and tries to defend her husband by attacking his attacker, and the way she attacks him is somehow revealing him in public or something involved in injuring him in the genital region, and in that way, so achi kaven lo. She had to have the intention to do that because she actually stuck out her hand and did that. Okay, le'olam Rabbi Yehuda. So no. That Braita has to be Rabbi Yehuda, and we have to explain how it can fit with Rabbi Yehuda, because Rabbi Yehuda had said that ein lavadim boshet, so now we have to explain. Rabbi Yehuda ein lavadim boshet. What does it mean when Rabbi Yehuda says that slaves do not have the rights to their embarrassment? So slaves are not given the monetary rights to their embarrassment, but in terms of assessment, in terms of the calculation of boshet, slaves actually would have the calculation of boshet. That is, the question of ein lavadim boshet gets into the question of who has the rights to the boshet. But it doesn't mean that a slave has no financial assessment for how much they would cost for them to be embarrassed. And therefore, what happened? You tried to embarrass the slave and you ended up embarrassing a free person. You pay the free person the money based on how much you would pay embarrassment for a slave. So you're using the assessment of a slave to pay to a free person, and that's what Rabbi Yehuda was talking about, and that fits with Rabbi Yehuda's shita. Okay, the Ibai Seima, alternatively, Afilu Tem Rabbi Meir. Maybe you could say it's even Rabbi Meir. Misavar Gadol Gadol b'nechasim, Katan Katan nechasim. No, who said that Gadol means a rich person and Katan means a poor person? Well, Gadol mamash, Gadol mamash, Katan mamash. No, Gadol means an adult and Katan means a child, and it could fit with Rabbi Meir's position as well. Because even though Rabbi Meir said everyone is on the same standing because we're all Bnei Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, we're all the descendants of our ancestors who were very high level. Nonetheless, that would apply differently to adults and children. Obviously, Rabbi Meir, even though he has a flat playing field in terms of adults, he wouldn't say that adults and children are equal regarding boshet. Okay. So the katan bar boshet, who is a katan? Is a child really someone who you would assess their boshet for? So in Kedamar Rav Papa lemachlim ole umichlam. So Rav Papa said, yes, there are cases where children could be embarrassed. The kind of embarrassment a child could suffer is that if you would tell a child this and they would actually be embarrassed, they would feel hurt by that, then that is something that actually you would be able to assess the boshet. That is, there are certain children who are young enough, or certain things that roll off kids' backs in a way that adults might take more seriously, and which would be worth nothing for a child. And there are older kids or types of embarrassment that would affect children, and there are ways in that sense. So our papa said you have to assess based on the mechlimo le umichlam. So hachanami de machlimo le umichlam. So
So drawing his attention to the fact that he was embarrassed, like actually.
If you point out, right. Well, or the point is that when does a child have boshet? When the child experiences the embarrassment of having been embarrassed. So that is, boshet, the financial calculation, will be applied if embarrassment, the emotion, is felt.
But the mechlim is that they are drawing his attention to.
Perhaps. I'm not sure if it's, I think it means more like if you would go up to a kid comparable to this kid and tell him the same thing, that he would be embarrassed, something like that. That's just a benchmark for calculating that. Okay, the next Mishnah, we'll go as far as we can. The Mishnah says, "Hamivayesh et ha'arum." If you embarrass someone who is naked, Hamivayesh et hasuma, or you embarrass someone who is blind, Hamivayesh et hayashen, or you embarrass someone who is asleep, chayav. You're liable for all those kinds of embarrassment. V'yashen shebiyesh, but a person who is asleep who embarrasses someone else, patur, that person is exempt. Nafal min hagag, a person fell off the roof, v'hizik, and caused the damage. Ubiyesh, and made someone embarrassed. Okay. So that's the same principle. That is, the person who fell off the roof by accident, obviously, and they damaged something and they embarrassed someone, then they pay for the nezek, they pay for the damage because adam muad leolam, but they don't pay for the boshet because boshet you have to have kavanah. And that was quoted already, if you could look on the side. That's on the Gemara on Kaf Zayin Amud Aleph. It came up when we were discussing Nezek. So now here Nezek comes up when we're discussing Boshet. The Gemara says, Tenu Rabbanan, Ba'isho Arum Chayav. Ve'ino Domeh Ba'isho Arum Le'Ba'isho Lavush. So not even though a person who embarrasses someone while they're naked is liable, it's nowhere near as embarrassing someone while they're clothed. That's the idea. And obviously, what kind of Boshet are we talking about? Presumably, it has something to do with being undressed in public or undressed in front of people who you feel you should be dressed in front of. So that's the difference, is that if a person is wearing their clothes and then you take their clothes off, that would be very embarrassing. If the person is sort of partially naked already and then you reveal them even more, it will be less embarrassing. It will still be embarrassing. So if you embarrass someone at the bathhouse, you're liable. And there's no comparison. Obviously, it's much more embarrassing to be embarrassed in the marketplace than it is to be embarrassed in the bathhouse. That is, in a locker room, you expect that people are going around naked or people are in a partial undress. Nonetheless, to be embarrassed in that way in the marketplace would be much, much more embarrassing.
That if a person's wearing like shatnez or not wearing like.
So for shatnez d'Rabbanan,
rip off their clothing.
So the Gemara discusses that the question of wearing shatnez d'Rabbanan in the suk. I think it's in Brachos. Is that a person who's wearing shatnez that's only shatnez midrabanan, they're allowed to continue wearing it and they don't have to take it off in the street because of kavod habriot. Because kavod habriot recognizes that a person being embarrassed in such a way, being naked in the marketplace, would be too much to ask. But if it's shatnez deoraita, you actually do have to take it off because the principle. So in terms of how many knots are attaching the wool to the linen or things like that. If it was one knot or two knots or one stitch or two stitches, things like that.
Kavod habriot trumps.
So kavod habriot. Exactly. Gemara's principle is a little bit confusing. People often take it out of or misapply it. It says kavod habriot doche lo taseh shabbat Torah. That kavod habriot overrides a negative prohibition in the Torah, in the singular. What does that mean? Does that mean it violates any negative prohibition in the Torah? No. It seems the way that that's applied by many of the Rishonim is it overrides one specific lo taseh in the Torah, which is the lo taseh, lo tasur, which means to follow rabbinic decrees. And therefore, what it really means is that again, the rabbis often speak in a kind of a code. We have to figure out. We have to rely on the interpretation. So that sense is that kavod habriot should override rabbinic rules in cases. And the kavod habriot, again, what kind of things are kavod habriot? Needing to bring something to wipe with to the bathroom on Shabbat, or shatnez d'Rabbanan, being clothed in the street, things that really have to do with very intimate aspects of a person being naked or having certain bodily functions, bodily needs. Many people nowadays try to apply kavod habriot. Everything becomes kavod habriot. Everything that's embarrassing is kavod habriot. Obviously, that's not the way Chazal use it. You have to look in the Gemara and see what kinds of things fall into that category.
Except where they can use the phrase, it's only rabbinic.
Only rabbinic. People say
I
only.
hear it all the time, and then you
Well,
think
there-
of the other side that says, but the rabbis are supposed to be
So there are many-
giving us Torah. So here you give an example.
There are many principles in the Gemara and in Halacha that can mitigate a rabbinic prohibition, but are not powerful enough to mitigate what's a biblical prohibition. Because the rabbis said, Heim Amru v'Hem Amru. The rabbis have the power to provide the parameters for their Gzeirot and their laws. So rabbinic laws are often a little bit more flexible in terms of certain kinds of mitigating circumstances. But it depends. There's a lot been written about that. That's perhaps the biggest. I mean, it's like a meta topic in Halacha. How do you? We're getting off track. Okay, so. Okay. Amar Mar. Baisho arum chayav. So the Braita had said, if you embarrass someone while they're naked, you're chayav. Arum bar boshet, who is a person who's already naked, someone who could be embarrassed, meaning the fact that you're naked in front of someone else means you sort of don't already, you don't have so much boshet. You're not going to be so embarrassed. So that's the question. So Amar of Papa, my arum, what does it mean, arum, that you were naked? Ta'atazika karichnu lema'aneh. The wind came and blew your clothes up. Again, remember, men back in the time of the Gemara used to wear like a long smock type of a robe, shirt type thing. So the wind could lift that up. People didn't wear underwear back then. And so, be'atahu b'dailinu tvei u'baishay. And then someone else, once the wind has come and blown up your robe, and then someone comes and pulls it even more. So you were as if already naked, and they made that experience even more embarrassing by revealing even more of you at that time. So to be embarrassed in the bathhouse, is it embarrassing to be in the locker room? It's not embarrassing. That everybody's changing. Everybody's naked in the locker room or in the sauna or something like that. No, it doesn't mean in the merchatz, in a closed private bathhouse. It means you were bathing by the river and someone came and embarrassed you. They hey, look, it's Plony. He's down by the river and he's naked and he's swimming. So that's the difference, and that's why it would be embarrassing, because it's semi-public, semi-private. It's not a closed bathhouse where the person feels protected or feels like they have some dignity. Okay. By Rabbi Abba Bar Memo, by Sho Yashain Umein. What happens if you embarrass a person while they're asleep, and then the person dies in their sleep? So the point is, the person never experienced the boshet themselves. They never experienced that embarrassment themselves. The question is whether or not the person is obligated to pay for the boshet to their heirs or not. We're going to see. So kami baile. The Amar Rav Zvid hacha kami baile. This is the question. Mishum kisufa. Who is it? Kisufa. Look in Rashi. So Rashi says chafayat panim. It's embarrassment to the person himself. It's some kind of distress that they feel in their emotional state. Okay. V'ha mitlei. And this person died, so he doesn't have any emotional response to this embarrassment. Kisufa, odilma mishum zilutahu. Maybe it's ziluta. Ziluta is a much broader sense of embarrassment. Look in Rashi. Ziluta shemizalzel bo bipnei rabim. That is, it's the experience of having embarrassed this person in front of other people. That is, it's not about whether or not the person feels embarrassed. It's a societal standard in terms of what does it mean to be embarrassed. And that's the question. V'ha ozlei. You still were mizalzel this person while they were alive, even though they never experienced the embarrassment themselves. Their person, their stature in society was reduced because of what you did, whether or not they actually felt the embarrassment. Okay, so Tashma, Rabbi Meir Omer Cheresh ve'Katan yesh lahem boshet. A deaf person and a child do have boshet. That is, something embarrassing could happen. You could embarrass them and you would be liable. Shota ein lo boshet. But a person who has, severe some kind of a mental illness or mental disability does not have boshet. The assumption being that the person who's not aware of their place in society at all basically can't experience boshet. Obviously, I think nowadays the way any modern person who has worked with people who have mental disabilities or things like that understands that many people, even who have, I think most people with mental disabilities nowadays, based on our society, would not fall into the category that the Gemara calls shota. Because a shota is someone who really does totally irrational things, doesn't have any awareness of what they're doing. Most people nowadays, even if they have a disability or if they have special needs and things like that, those are people who are still aware of their place in society. They're still aware of who they are. Obviously, they can be embarrassed. It's a very different kind of person than what the Gemara talks about shota. It's important to note. Okay, so shota ein lo boshet. So what?
Yeah,
Right, sorry. Yeah, if you're going to say it's because of their place in society that they would become embarrassed. That's why it says katan, because katan doesn't have kisufa in the same way. Katan is not going to feel the personal embarrassment the same way, or we don't care as much because children, whatever, kids make fun of each other all the time. It rolls off their backs in a different way. Or again, it depends the psychology of it, but the sense that a person's standing in society is not going to be hampered so much. So that's why it comes to teach katan. Eliyamar mishum kisufa katan barbo shethu. But if you're going to say it's because of kisufa, is a katan really connected to that sense of boshet? Because a katan has much less personal sense of worth that's going to be damaged by this embarrassment.
So
we're going to see. Ella my mishum ziluta. Maybe you'll say it's because of ziluta. It's because of their societal standing. Afilu shota nami. But then you would say a shota as well. A shota still has a sense of how their place in society would be affected by having been embarrassed. That is, for even the Gemara's shota, that is someone who's totally unaware of their standing, it's still embarrassing for the people around them if they've been embarrassed by someone else. Okay? So, Amri, shota ein lecha boshet gadol mezo. That is, there's a suggestion that to be a shota already is very embarrassing for society. That is, their family members, perhaps, or the people who live near them, they already have a sense of what that means, that was embarrassing for them. Therefore, there's no additional boshet to be calculated. Okay, mikom makom nifshot minei mishum ziluta. So maybe we should still extract from this that the assessment of boshet should be based on ziluta, based on the person's society standing in society. The mishum kisufa katambar kisufahu. Are you going to say, if you're going to tell me that it's because of kisufa, it's because the person, katan, doesn't have that kind of personal awareness? The Kedama Rav Papa, no, it must be like Rav Papa said, exactly like Hillel suggested. Rav Papa said, so Rav Papa said, even a katan could have kisufa, could have that personal sense of hurt, based on the fact that a katan is aware of the kinds of things that could be embarrassing, but at a certain age. A 2-year-old is different than an 8-year-old. An 8-year-old is different than a 12-year-old. So those kinds of things are going to provide a sliding scale. So so too, here we should assess it based for a katan. If it's something that the child would be embarrassed by, that would be something that you would calculate boshet. Papa amar hachi kami by. Let me shum kisufa didei. Is it based on his own embarrassment behind ma'isle, and then this person has already died? Or is it based on embarrassment to the family at whole? That is, even if it's based on kisufa, and we're willing to include a katan based on a kisufa, based according to Rav Papa, nonetheless, is it the person's personal sense, or is it for their whole family? That's a little bit wider. Hashma, cherish v'katan yesh la boshet. A child and a deaf person do have boshet. Shota ein bo boshet, and a shota does not have boshet. So yeah, mar bishlam mishum boshet mishpacha. If you're going to say it's because of the family, hainu diktani katan. That's why it said katan. That is, if katan doesn't have a personal sense of value, but for their whole family, it would be embarrassing. Eli amar mishum kisufa didei katan bar boshet. Who are we going to say that a katan has boshet? Elamai mishum boshet dibdei mishpacha. It must be because it's for the family. Afilu shota nami. But for a shota, then we would include it even for the family of the shota. We would say that a shota also has boshet. So shota ein lecha boshet gdola mizo. There's a suggestion that for the family, there's still a certain amount of boshet for the family to have a shota in their family already, and therefore, to that extent, there would not be no extension if the shota were to be embarrassed. Okay. Mikom makom nifshot minei mishum boshet mishpacha the mishalem the mishum kisufa katan bar kisufa. Who is a katan bar kisufa? Amar Rav Papa in the machlim olei machlam. So Rav Papa, again, the suggestion of Rav Papa, a child's embarrassment, even at the personal level, could be assessed based on how much they would be embarrassed and what would happen to them that they would be embarrassed. Okay. The Hatanya, Rabbi Omer cherish yesh la boshet, shota ein la boshet. And this brisa says Rebbe's position, which actually agrees with all of the Rav Papa positions now, is going to be brought down the halacha. A cheresh, a deaf person, always has boshet. Shota ain't no boshet. A shota never has boshet. Katan pamim yeshlo, pamim ain't lo. Child sometimes has boshet and sometimes not, depending on how it's assessed. Okay. And it must be the explanation of that brisa, according to Rebbe's position, must fit with Rav Papa. We've seen the whole conclusion, which is that a child's embarrassment is going to be assessed based on how they can feel it, even at the personal level. And you don't have to extend it to the broader sense of ziluta, but it would cause embarrassment to society. It could even be assessed at the personal level. We'll stop there. That was Pei Vav and Ben. We'll pick up there tomorrow with the next step.